everyone, and welcome to Encounter Church Online. My name is Jason, one of the pastors on staff here at the church, and we are so glad that each and every single one of you have taken the opportunity to be with us today. Whether you're watching right now live or you're checking in some point later in the week, we believe that today, in this very moment, that God has a special word for you, and we are so glad that you're with us. If you are new to Encounter, we would love to send you this mug. If you'll go to encounterchurch.com/connect. Once you give us your information, you can also let us know how we can stay in touch with you. We want to send you this gift. If you give us your address, it'll be on the way this week. We are also excited about the opportunity to have Encounter Church at home for your kids. So if you have a preschooler or an elementary age kiddo, our team has worked super hard to produce something every week so that they can have church at home. And really, it's on demand. That doesn't have to be Sunday morning. It can be at any point. So if they're busy right now and you want to enjoy church, that's okay. Just remember the website, encounterchurch.com/kids. They can go to that at any time. And we have a special service that we have prepared for them. In just a moment, our pastor is going to come and continue a great series that we started just a few weeks ago entitled The Bible for Grown-Ups. We hope that you enjoy.
The Bible, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God. The Bible.
The Bible, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God. The Bible.
The Bible, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word.
Hey, Bob. What are you doing?
Nothing. Just cleaning up a little.
Good morning. Welcome to Encounter Church. So glad that you've decided to join us today as we continue our series called The Bible for Grown-Ups. Over the course of this month, we've been looking at this tension that for many of us, as we were growing up in our faith, we felt a pull or a struggle to maybe potentially actually grow out of our faith. This week I was watching and researching and came across a pastor in Canada and was kind of watching his story unfold. And here's a pastor who went from being someone who every week was teaching from the Bible to being someone, because of some of the things in the Bible, walking away from his faith. And that one of the kind of personal challenges and pressure points for me, even as a parent, is I want to make sure that the faith that I'm passing on to my kids is a faith that they can grow up in, not just grow out of. And that one of the challenges that can happen in the process of growing up in faith is that sometimes we don't always get the complexity, or we have an experience or a moment happens. The fairy tale reality doesn't play out the way we thought. And to kind of kick off this series at the very beginning of this month, I said, look, this is the foundation I want us to have for all of our dialogues around this. That I said, look, Jesus did not write the Bible. That it's important not just that we know the Bible stories, but that the story of the Bible is essential too if we're going to grow in confidence and continue to grow up in our faith. That Jesus is the reason for the Bible. That the central event of Christianity, the hinge point of history, the one thing that all of this stands on is that there is a tomb in Jerusalem that is empty, and that it's been empty for over 2,000 years because Jesus was placed in that tomb, and 3 days later he walked out. And in the process, he birthed a movement that transformed the world and is still in the process of transforming the world today. And that's the foundational point for us to have any conversation through this month as we talk about the Bible for grown-ups. But what I want to do today is maybe press in a little bit more, because the reality is that either you and I are going to meet someone whose story is that they grew out of faith, or we're going to be faced with a moment and a challenge where we could be tempted or potentially find a faith that we could grow out of too. And I recognize for some of us that our faith is such a central part of our lives, and the idea of kind of growing out of our faith just seems to be absurd. But what I recognize and what some of us have already experienced is that life has a way of shaking us to our core. That we start off and that we have this solid belief, and then we go through a divorce, or then we get that cancer kind of diagnosis, or then our family starts to fall apart, and all of a sudden our belief starts to evaporate, and we start to wonder, was all this just a lie? Because I tried to honor God and it didn't play out like I thought it would. I tried to be faithful. I was giving generously, and then I lost my job. I fought to make sure my relationships honored God, and then he had an affair, or she walked away. And in those moments, our faith can be shaken to a place where we really do start to wonder, is this just a lie? And look, for some of us, this may not be something that maybe you'll ever go through, but someone you love will. And if for no other reason, I'm giving this series, this message today because I've got a little girl and a little boy that I hope if they hit one of these 3 walls in their future, that this message is still there, even if I'm not there, to give them wisdom. Because there are 3 distinct things that I want to look at today as we talk about the Bible for grown-ups. 3 kind of catalysts that can happen and play out in the moment in the lives of just everyday life that could be the thing that prevents us from growing up in our faith and potentially be the reason we grew out of it. It's all 3 of these different items are actually found in the same story. And I want to kind of set the backdrop for you. In Mark chapter 4, we see all 3 of these play out in slow motion. For those who are kind of new to Christian scripture, Mark was written, it's an early kind of biographical account of the life of Jesus. It's named after the author Mark. Mark gets his source material from Peter. And so Peter, who's one of the original followers of Jesus, sits down with Mark and says, hey, here's what's happened to me. Here's how it went down. And he tells him all these stories. And Mark 4, the entire chapter is framed around this, a boat. This boat actually is nicknamed the Jesus boat, even though there's no historical reason to believe Jesus was actually ever in this boat or his disciples. But it's called the Jesus boat because this boat was discovered in 1986 when the Sea of Galilee had experienced an extreme drought in the region. And as the water receded, some kind of amateur archaeologists discovered in the ground, poking up, they discovered this. And as 12-year process unfolded, they were eventually able to bring this up out of the water and into kind of solid ground, and were able to coat it. And in the process, they gave us a picture, a living picture of a glimpse of what a boat in that first century would have looked like. It's about 20 feet long, it's about 7 feet wide, and it's about 4 feet high from the bottom to the top along the edges. And that this type of boat is central to Mark chapter 4. It begins, the opening portion of the chapter begins with Mark writing about Jesus being in this boat, pushing off from the shore so that he could speak to the large crowds that had gathered. And the section that we're going to get into today is Jesus is in that same boat, and the day has gone by, the crowds have been taught, Jesus has performed and done amazing things, and the day is wrapping up, and now Jesus wants to move on to the next location. It says, that day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side being the Sea of Galilee. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was in the boat. there were also other boats with them. So the disciples, the followers of Jesus, are now kind of traversing across the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee was kind of geographically unique. It's kind of landscape, the way it's positioned, where it's positioned, tends to cause frequent storms to come up. So some of Jesus' followers were fishermen. They were from this area. And so they were used to the storms that could arise at a moment's notice. But this night was going to be a little different. You see, it says that a furious squall. Now remember that Peter is telling Mark these details. And so for Peter to say a furious squall came up, Peter's like, look, I grew up fishing in the Sea of Galilee. I know what it's like for one of those Sea of Galilee storms to come up out of nowhere. This wasn't like one of those kind of storms. This thing was ferocious. It was furious. It was terrifying. And it comes up out of nowhere. And the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And so as he's telling this to Mark, Mark is like, oh, it's swamped. Another word for swamp would be full. And in other words, that 4-foot difference between the bottom of the boat and the top of the boat, the waves are cresting over and beginning to fill the boat. And the boat, when it says nearly swamped, it's that the boat is actually beginning to sink. Now, the back of the boat was higher than the front, and so most likely the boat was beginning to tilt forward, and water was beginning to rush in, and it was starting to go down. And it says that, so Jesus was in the stern, the back of the boat, which is the higher piece, and he's sleeping on a cushion. And the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" So here's the setting. Jesus is asleep. He's exhausted. He's spent all day talking, teaching, performing miracles. And so he's collapsed on the back. Some of you know what it's like after a hard day's work. And you could probably sleep through a storm too. And that's what he's doing. And the disciples are watching the boat slowly start to kind of dip down, down, down. And they go and they shake him and they're like, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" They're like, "Look, you're our leader. Do something." Because we're terrified that we're not going to make it. And that what we see play out in this story, I think, has a lot of implications for us as we learn to embrace the Bible for grown-ups. As we begin to lean in, and that part of kind of a defining moment in that growing up in our faith oftentimes has the same 3 catalysts for the 3 things that can cause us to grow out of our faith too. And you actually see those 3 things in this story. You see experiences, emotions, and expectations. Oftentimes, there's an experience, there's some emotions, or there's some unmet expectations that are often at the root of us being tempted to kind of weaken or grow out of the faith that we have. And for many of us, you know, when you read about David and Goliath, and all of a sudden you realize that sometimes Davids get killed by Goliaths, that what made David and Goliath so exceptional was the fact that it was an exception to the rule. Or that good people can get sick and bad people can become billionaires. You start to struggle and wrestle with, say, well, maybe those Bible stories I was taught growing up don't really have a lot for the grown-up life. And that in this simple passage, this very kind of short moment, we see all 3 of these catalytic pieces present. The first is experiences. The experiences that we go through that catch us off guard, that they end up marking us, that go way beyond just the moment that we find ourselves in. I don't know about you, but this thing here has caused all kinds of interesting thoughts for me. This is a murder hornet. That's not really its name. It's an Asian or Japanese hornet. There's a very scientific name for it, but colloquially it's been called the murder hornet because this is actually in life size. You can ride its back, not really. But in my head, that's what it feels like. It's ginormous. It is massive. This thing flies in and can massacre an entire colony of bees in a few hours by decapitating their heads. Like this thing is like the Jason Bourne of insects, right? I mean, it is intense. And so, but before this thing haunted me in my sleep, I was haunted by this thing. Now, I know it looks cute because it's a bumblebee, all kind of doing its pollination thing on that cute yellow flower. But see, what I was plagued by growing up, what I was haunted by was this thing. This terrified me more than murder hornets did. You see, because when I was about 8, 10 years old, I was playing out in a wooded area, and we were playing hide and seek, and I went to dive on the ground. And when I dived on the ground to hide from my friends, I landed on something and I felt a sharp sting in my leg. So I jumped up immediately. And when I jumped up, all of a sudden out of nowhere, swarms of these things came flying at me. I was bitten and stung over 40 plus times. I'm screaming in fear. There are bees trying to climb into my mouth. They are pressing up into my nose. I see them hanging off of my eyelids. They're all over my face, all over my body, and they are lighting me up. A few hours later, I just passed out from the pain. This marked me. In my bloodstream today, I'm still supposed to carry an EpiPen because my body's reaction from that day. But that experience, almost 30 years ago, still shows up in surprising ways. On my honeymoon, almost 15 years ago to this month, happy anniversary, right? So in a couple weeks, it'll be 15 years. So 15 years ago, on the second day, I'm married to my beautiful bride. We're walking into this mountain cabin, and as we're walking in, all of a sudden I hear that sound that creates a supernatural, terrifying fear response. The bzzz. And I look, and there's a bee flying right at me. And so I did the only thing you do when you're in a moment like that. I was behind my wife, and there was the mountain cabin. So I threw her into the bushes towards the bee, and I ran inside and closed the door. Because I figured she loved me, and so she was willing to take a bee hit for me, right? I mean, that's what you do. You push your bride into the bushes so you don't get bit by a bee. That is how you start your second day of marriage strong, right? I mean, like my poor wife had to be thinking, okay, I don't like the trend line. Yesterday was good. That was the baseline. Today he pushed me in a bush because of a bee. I don't want to see day 3 with this guy, right? I mean, so this was pretty terrifying. But the reason I tell you that is because that experience marked me, but it also went beyond just me and even affected my relationship because I have been apologizing for 15 years for shoving my wife into the bushes because of a bee. But in that moment, that bee, that experience, robbed me of a relationship I had with someone who was so much better and so much greater than a bee. And that sometimes, if we're not careful, the experiences we find ourselves in can cause us to experience tunnel vision. And we lose sight of the grander reality. We lose sight of the bigger picture of life. And all we see is what's right in front of us. I was reading an article last night about this common experience that humans have called getting lost. It's one of the scariest things that can happen to you when you're little. Think about how afraid you were of like potentially like getting lost from your parents. And that one of the things that happens when people are lost is that most times, because of our human brains, we tend to walk around in circles. We don't even realize it when we get disoriented. We go around in a circle. But the most startling fact was part of this study in this article was saying that most people, when they get lost, they never actually travel more than 100 yards from the point in which they got lost in the first place. Like, think about that. You may be in the woods for days, and you never travel more than the average person lost never travels more than 100 yards from the place they got lost, because they just naturally start doing circles because they get disoriented. And I feel like sometimes that's what happens when we go through these experiences is we get disoriented and we lose sight of the reality. In that moment, it sometimes can cause you to shove your wife into a bush and run into the house and lock the door and scream, "Take her instead, not me." Right? It happens. But the experiences oftentimes aren't by themselves. There's often a kind of an emotional aspect that goes with it. I remember early in my Christian journey, I became a Christian halfway in college, and my life was completely changed. I knew that I was different from the inside out. I woke up every day with that experience. If my little girl, Ella, wakes up every day, and it's the greatest day ever. She comes out, it's like the sun is shining, like birds are chirping, unicorns are flying over the rainbow that came up with the sun. I mean, it's like cupcakes and sprinkles everywhere. I am not that type. I am more like REM, everybody hurts, okay? Like, it's just like Eeyore, but with a little bit better disposition. So in the aftermath of becoming a Christian, I woke up every day and it was like being my daughter. It was like, the day is awesome, the sun is bright, the grass is green, the sky is blue, I love life. And it was a radical soundtrack shift in my life. And it was because of my faith. But about 9-10 months into my journey, I started waking up and the music, like, everything is awesome, had started to slowly kind of shift to like, when the day is long and the night is yours alone. Like, I started kind of slowly turning towards the like dark again. And I remember sitting down with a group of people and I was so terrified that I was losing my faith. Because I'd went from all of this excitement about Christianity to now some of the darkness and the kind of the drabness of life was starting to kind of creep back in. It was sort of that wet blanket feeling again. And one of the best things that ever happened to me was around that 9-month mark and voicing to someone who was wiser than me that, hey, I'm afraid I'm losing my faith. And they're like, why? And I was like, because I don't feel the feelings I used to feel. And they're like, well, I want to encourage you. It doesn't sound like to me you're losing faith. It sounds like to me you're losing feelings. And feelings aren't the same thing as faith. In fact, they gave me an illustration kind of in that season that has continued to help me. They're like, look, the train engine of your faith, that train car, the train engine was never meant to be your feelings. It was meant to be the grace and the God's love for you and your commitment out of that. Like, that is the engine on your train. Feelings are just the caboose. It's a nice thing to have, but you don't need it for the train to get where it's going. And that was a really freeing moment for me because I realized I no longer had to define my faith by the feelings I felt. And as I've gotten older, as I've matured in my 15 years relationship with my wife and with my kids, it's become even more crystal clear to me that feelings as a driver actually are not a sign of maturity, they're a sign of immaturity. A sign of maturity in relationship, a sign of maturity in love, and a sign of maturity in faith is that the commitment, the choice, precedes the feeling. And that the feelings aren't the driver for the action, they're the benefit and response to the action. That if I wait till I feel like I love my wife, there are some days where I'm not going to move or act as much as I should. But I've always found that if I act, if I move, if I do, then what oftentimes comes on the backside of that is a whole kind of wash of feelings that are appropriate. When it's late at night and, she's 3 feet from the thing that needs to be turned on or turned off because we use a noise machine. And I'm, because of my position, like 9 to 15 feet from that item. And she's like, oh, we forgot to turn on the sound machine, which is code for you need to turn on the sound machine. And I'm laying in the bed and I'm like doing the math. I'm like, woman, you are 36 inches from that sound machine. You can get that sound machine faster than I could. You could have gotten to that and gotten back by the time you said that phrase. And I'm like sitting there, and nothing in me wants to get out of my comfy bed where I'm exhausted. And I make a choice to traverse that 12 or 15 feet, to turn it on, and to get back in the bed. And it's amazing how I do not feel like doing it on the way. I had this a couple nights ago. I was like literally sitting over there soaking, like, you are 36 inches. Why? And then on the way back after I did it, and I got in bed, and I like snuggled up, and she's like, thank you. And I'm like, girl, you know I'd do anything for you. I'd climb a mountain as long as that mountain wasn't more than 15 feet, right? And I'm like snuggled up. All of a sudden the feelings flow then. And I believe that oftentimes, if we're not careful, we can allow the emotions to rob our focus, to hijack our motivations. Feelings were never meant to be our motivation. They were meant to be the whipped cream and the cherry on the top of that sundae. But you can experience a sundae without the whipped cream or the cherry. And that, if we're not careful, those emotions become the replacement. And where our faith is only as strong as the feelings we have in that moment. Which is why maybe for some of us, when we look at our faith and we were to track it, it looks like a stock market because it's up and down, because we're allowing our feelings to be the driving force instead of it being a reaction to the initial action of our commitment and love out of what God has done for us. And the third is around expectations. And I think this is where, for many of us growing up, maybe with faith stories being taught to us, that we were never taught these things, but I think what happens is they get caught. You hear about David defeating Goliath. You hear about God bringing Moses out of the promised land. You hear about Hannah, who struggled with infertility, having Samuel. You read these stories of people and victory and, like breakthrough and financial provision. And then those stories start to mirror back on your life and you notice what's missing. You're 5 years into the infertility and there's still no Samuel in your life. Or you were faithful and generous and you even tithe and you were giving over 10% of what you make back to God. And all of a sudden you're faced with unemployment. And all of a sudden some of those unvoiced expectations spill over. Like, God, I lived for you and now he walked away from me. Like, I was faithful to you and to him and he abandoned me. And it starts to feel a little bit like you abandoned me too. And all of a sudden you're sitting with a doctor and you've done everything you could your entire life. You've exercised, you've taken care of yourself, and now the doctor is looking at you and you're in your 40s and they're like, it's not good. Something came back on your report and we need to talk about it. And all of a sudden, that unvoiced expectation that you had with God, this contract that he never signed with you, is kind of brought up to the surface. And you're like, but God, look what I've done for you. Weren't you supposed to do these things for me? And that, I think one of the most destructive things that can happen to our faith is that we allow the unvoiced, unbiblical expectations to begin to shape and to affect how we live out our faith. God never promised for you or for me that if we lived for him, that it would be easy, convenient. He never promised any of that. He never promised that if you practice generosity, that it necessarily means you're always going to be financially well. Like, bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. And the reality is that we're all bad, and there's a little bit of good in all of us, and that it's not as clean cut maybe as what we grew up with. And that as you start to drill into it and you start to live it out and walk through experiences, these little infractions where you believe God was supposed to have X, Y, or Z for you and he didn't. And eventually it just builds up and you're like, okay, God, 3 strikes, you're out and I'm out. And as I was thinking about that pastor this week, I realized, you know what? It was actually a gift for him. Because I'm not sure that if we are growing in a faith that you can grow out of, if you're growing in a faith that you can grow out of, it's probably not a faith that you should have ever grown in the first place. Because it's a fairy tale. It's not true. That the Christian faith is so much bigger, so much greater in its promise than health, wealth. It's so much truer than a God who just gives in exchange or is the Santa Claus in the sky. In fact, what's fascinating to me is that the backdrop of Christianity is that the worst possible thing happened to the best possible person. I don't think any Christian legitimately, when looking at the Christian story that birthed it all, can simply say, if I pull these levers, then God's going to do this for me. Because reality is that the best person ever experienced the worst possible thing ever. And if that was the reality and the backdrop of what birthed Christianity, then I don't think there's room in our faith for just simple, like, hey, if you do this for God, God's going to bless you, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. I'm not saying those things don't happen sometimes, but I'm just saying that the expectation for those to happen all the time is not healthy. And they end up robbing us of what we could have. And that if we're going to experience the Bible for grown-ups, if we're going to grow up in a faith that's worth growing up in, then we have to realize that maybe there's something to do with those experiences and the emotions and the expectations that actually God was behind in the first place. Maybe that he was, like Jesus, open to using some of it. So my daughter is hilarious. A few months ago, I found myself having an argument with her at bedtime because I caught her smuggling this into the bed. I looked over and I was like, she's acting suspicious. And I'm like, oh my goodness, look at that. It's the phone case. It's her phone. Right? Well, sometimes I'm sitting there and I'm like, hey, sweetie, what are you doing? She's like, I'm texting my BFF. Or hold on a second. I'm talking to my friend. And literally, like getting ready for bed one night, I found that she had smuggled her phone into her bed. And I'm like, Ella, your phone does not belong in the bed. And I'm like, why am I arguing with an 8-year-old about a paper phone? Because that's all it is. It's a piece of card. It's like a piece of cardstock that's got little apps drawing on it. It's adorable, right? Like there's her little music app. She can like press and, jam out to whatever it is she's jamming out to. And as I was thinking about this passage, I realized in some ways this is a lot like what Jesus was doing. Jesus recognized that sitting in that boat that night, in the midst of the storm, were people who had faith that were a lot like this. Like this looks like a phone. It's rooted. It's a reflection of a reality. But this doesn't nearly compare to this. This is so much better than this. This allows me to actually text and call and listen to real music. This is just make-believe. This is actually make. And what Jesus is doing in that boat, I believe, is he used those three things to do something extraordinary. Notice it says that he gets up, he rebuked the wind, and he said to the waves, quiet, be still. Then the wave died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified, and they asked each other, who is this that the wind and the waves obey him? Who is this? The terror they had for the storm had been exchanged for a healthy, reverent awe of the one in the boat with them. That the disciples had stepped in absolutely committed and convinced that the faith they had was a faith worth following. And in the process of the storm, the expectations, the emotions, and the experiences helped to reveal to them that what they were holding in their hand wasn't quite as good as what Jesus held in his. And that what I believe the entire Gospels, so much of the Gospel storyline can be completely visualized with Jesus intentionally over 3 years exchanging this for this. And that I think that what comes into our life through emotions, expectations, through experiences, things that we are convinced could be things that could derail us, don't have to be things to destroy our faith. They can actually be gifts to help deepen our faith. That as Christians, or maybe people who are struggling with Christianity, we don't have to be afraid of the experiences we walk through, the emotions we have, or the unmet expectations being bubbled up to the surface. Because if we're willing to embrace them, what we can find, like what we see in this story, is that God is trying to give us an encounter with Him that exchanges the weak, the shadowy, the less than for the greater. And that there is a faith that is childlike, that can mark you as an adult. But all the childish parts of the faith, the self-centeredness, the selfishness, they get sanded away each time we walk through those expectations, experiences, and emotions. God can use them to sand away the parts of our faith that can't withstand those three. And in the end, we're left with something worth far more valuable than just a sheet of paper. We're left with something that connects us to a God who never fails us, who gives us a grander perspective that the one who's with us is greater than the storm around us, and that a God who is faithful, who's never failed, can even carry us through our valleys of the shadow of death. And that ultimately God's desire as we grow up in our faith is that we would grow into a faith that can sustain us through whatever our grown-up years have for us. And that the Bible for grown-ups, no matter who you are, is so much better than just some flannel graph, is so much greater than just some simple stories that have been reduced down to some simple plot lines that you can follow along as an 8-year-old. That the story of Christianity is so much bigger than just Sunday morning Sunday schools. But it's that the God of the universe stepped into this planet to pursue you and I. And that through what He did almost 2,000 years ago by walking out of the grave, you and I can walk in that same power today. And that no matter what you are going through, no matter what you're experiencing, your faith doesn't have to be destroyed by it. It can actually be deepened because the God who was on that boat, exchanging their weak faith for something stronger, is still in the business of doing that today too. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you that there is a faith that is greater and stronger than even what we currently have. Thank you that you invite us into that. You offer to exchange what we have for what we could. Thank you for the faith that brings joy, peace, and hope even in the midst of circumstances that have none of it. And I pray that for those who are walking with you, God, that you would help us to daily, in the small moments where these things play out and in the big seasons of life where we experience them, that you would help us to walk in faith and exchange what we have for what you desire for us to have. And God, for those who maybe because of emotions or experiences or some unvoiced expectations, God, I pray that even right now that they would grow in appreciation for the fact that what they grew out of was never worth growing up in the first place. And that they would hit reset and maybe begin to turn back towards Christianity in the first place. And I thank you, Father, that right now, as people listen to this prayer, as they've listened to this message, that you are more present, more close than even my voice in their life. Thank you for your word, your hope, your life. Thank you for the Bible. And I pray that you would help us to grow in it and grow up in you. And it's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. I want to thank you for joining us today. Our team has put together a song that I think captures, for many of us, the sentiment of where we are. If you're in the midst of a challenging experience or a really kind of difficult moment, that the song that they've prepared today called Oceans speaks to that heart's cry of like, God, I need faith to navigate this journey. I need faith. I need you to give me a greater faith than what I have so that I can step out, so that I can continue to be encouraged and believe that you are still for me, that you are still with me, that even the things that happen in my life, they may describe what I'm going through, but they don't define who I am in you. And that this song may just, maybe for right now, or maybe you come back to it later and just allow him to meet you in the midst of it. I want to encourage you. This, for some of you, walking through what we know you're walking through, this could be a song that you could put that flag in the ground and say, open-handed, God, I need an exchange and what I have for what I know you desire for me to have. One of the things I love about being the church, because this is not the church. This is a building where a sermon is being recorded and where the church gathers. The church is the people. What I love about being the church is that being the people of God, we get to be a part of what God is doing. That there are legitimately people who've walked away from the Christian faith because Christians weren't living out their faith. But that we get to be a part of a faith community that sincerely believes and sincerely behaves and is becoming the type of church God intended when He purchased it on the cross and secured its victory through the resurrection. And that one of the ways that we practically do that is through your generosity, through the generosity of families like your family, like our family, who give and believe that God can do more together with us than He could ever just do by myself and our family's generosity. And that because of the generosity of people who call Encounter Church home, because of the way that you've given, for those who've automated their giving, which has allowed us to be even more diligent and more kind of intentional in how we plan, you've enabled us to be able to give to 25 families in this season. That we've been able to step in and help 25 different families who are walking through unemployment connected to this church, which is amazing. That we've been able to give, to buy gift cards from local restaurants, so that even as we step in to help people who need food, that we can actually accomplish two different things at the same time. That you've allowed us to donate food to local food banks because food banks have felt the pinch in this season. And that your generosity has even allowed us to go beyond and to even partner with orphanages in areas of the world that are dealing with COVID-19 but don't have the social structures that we do in the United States. And that those are some of the things that your generosity is allowing us to do in this season. And we're so grateful. And that we know that the people on the other side of those generous acts, what they're experiencing, what they're encountering is a picture of God that God intended the church to be for them when they met with Him. And so thank you for those who give, for those who automate, for those who continue to believe, even in the midst of the season as they walk through hard times, that God has a bigger plan for us and can use us, that we're not just a church that believes in the cross, that we're a church that also believes in the resurrection, and that we embrace both. And so as we wrap up today, our band's going to lead us in the song Oceans. And I would encourage you, if there's something that you're struggling with in this season, that in your heart, maybe you don't have the moment right now with kids running around, but that you would come back, you would put it on your calendar to come back to this song, to come back to that moment, and just before God Almighty who sees you and hears you, and you don't need me for God to hear you. You just kind of say, God, here's what I'm struggling with. whether it's the infertility, whether it's the financial insecurity, whether it's the relationship issues, whether it's some personal struggles and doubts on the inside, and that you would find that He's still a God who's meeting with people in the middle of storms in their life and bringing peace even in the midst of big waves. And so I hope you enjoy, and I hope you're ministered to by this song, and I'll be up at the end to close this out. Thank you.
You call me out on the waters, the great unknown, where feet may fail. And there I find you in the mystery, in oceans deep, my faith will stand. And I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours. You are mine. Oh. Your grace abounds in deepest waters. Your sovereign hand will be my guide. Where feet may fail, fear surrounds. You've never failed, and you won't start now. So I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours. You are mine. Oh, you are mine. You are mine. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let
you for to just lean into these songs. I want to thank you for believing that God is still inviting us into new places and new spaces to experience the exchange of a faith that's even greater than the faith that we have now. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you next week as we continue our series, The Bible for Grown-ups. God bless. See you then.